Hello and welcome to the Venezuelanalysis podcast. And we're doing something a little bit different this month. We're going to have a casual conversation with fellow Venezuelanalysis writer Andreína Chávez just about the state of Latin America, where things are at. Obviously, there's been a lot of momentous things happening in the region. We had the election of Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico on June 2nd. We had what looks to be an attempted coup, although there's been some dispute about the authenticity of those military movements that we saw in Bolivia. And then, of course, at the end of this month, something very important for the region is the Venezuelan presidential elections on July 28th. So there's a lot of things happening in the region, and I thought we would have a conversation about it. But I thought we would start actually with some commentary from you, Andreína, about your latest column for Venezuelanalysis, where you talk about soft power and hard power. And I actually think that's a great starting point when we want to think about how things actually operate in Latin America. What is the role of US imperialism? How does it exert its influence? Tell us, what's for you this difference between hard power, soft power?
Yeah, thank you, José Luis. It's always great to be in the podcast. And this is an awesome different format to be in. And well, I think just really correct about the fact that we need to talk more about how the United States uses different strategies to influence in global South countries, how they use different mechanisms to make sure that the regime change agenda is always going forward. So we need to understand that they do things that are very aggressive, things that are very destructive, and we call that hard power, which is basically imposing economic sanctions against a country, making these efforts to isolate that country in diplomatic events, and of course also the usual, which is carrying these military interventions, or trying to create a military war in a country. So I think Venezuela, of course, is one of the most recent examples of how the US uses this hard power strategy to try to defeat a government, to try to overthrow a government, to try to create a political and economic destabilization that is so difficult that people leave the country, that everything that we knew, life the way we knew it, it was almost completely destroyed for so many years, to the point that our country became unrecognizable. And many people thought that, of course, this is going to lead to the overthrowing of the government, because this is a situation that is nobody's going to withstand, nobody's going to be able to resist this for so long. But we did. We resisted for this long, and the government, thankfully, is still in place because it is an elected, democratically elected government. But yeah, so to clarify very well what you were asking me, so hard power are these really aggressive strategies that the US uses against countries that they wish to change the government. And usually the most devastating strategy, it is imposing economic sanctions. In the case of Venezuela, they impose sanctions against every sector of the Venezuelan economy, but especially against the oil industry, because the oil industry, it is our main source of resources. It is practically what sustains the country's economy in every sense of the word. So they did this in a way to try to make sure that the right conditions were created for the government to be overthrown. Now, Venezuela has also been the victim of many other hard power strategies. This isn't the only one. We have also been the victims of strategies that are about trying to military intervene the country. And I don't know if you remember this, but in 2020, we had an attempt of a mercenary invasion in Venezuela. We have these US Marines who were trying to invade the country. And of course, they failed because the whole plan was absolutely incredibly stupid. But nonetheless, it was a real attempt to invade the country. And before that, like a few years, only a couple of years before that, we had the whole Battle of the Bridges. I don't know if you remember this as well. This happened in the border with Colombia, when these right-wing governments in the region tried to support a supposed humanitarian aid convoy to enter Venezuela, and in reality, it was a way to stage a foreign intervention in the country. And so, yeah, we've been practically been like an experiment of how to apply every single tactic of hard power to try to overthrow a government. And thankfully, it has failed time and time again.
There is a line here that I think really illustrates, even though we kind of categorize it in these two different distinct categories, you say the following: these are two sides of the same coin used to achieve the same desired outcome. And you list a bunch of examples of soft power exercises in Venezuela. So I was hoping maybe you could talk about those examples. What are some of the concrete ways that we've seen? So we talked a little bit about the hard power, but what are these elements that we've seen? Because I think it's actually really useful for us when we're thinking about the region, because what's in a lot of ways, Venezuela seems like it's a training ground for all of these strategies. I remember there was one line that I really appreciated said by President Maduro, where he talked about the whole Guaido strategy, the parallel government, the government of Narnia, as you call it, over in Venezuela, where if it had been successful, that would have been the model for the rest of Latin America. That they would have tried to implement something similar, like, no longer recognizing the democratically elected government, pretending that they don't have legitimacy, trying to assign resources and attention and recognition to figures that don't actually represent the population, that came from nowhere, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm convinced by that. I think that was actually a really good point made by the president, saying that this would have been the model to follow. So, like I said, so Venezuela in a lot of ways is like a training ground. So tell us about some of these examples of soft power and how it's different from hard power.
Yeah, so hard power has another side of the coin, like you said, which is soft power. And sometimes we don't talk enough about soft power because, of course, everything that is sanctions and military intervention is just so much more aggressive, so much more destructive, that you sort of focus on that. But soft power is always there. It's always sort of like paving the way for the regime change agenda to continue to move forward. Even when all the hard power strategies are sometimes failing, soft power is always there, making sure that the entire regime change plan doesn't completely fall apart. And it's very successful in many ways. So, for example, in Venezuela, we have many cases of soft power strategies that have been applied over the years. One of the most, let's say, important ones, it is the funding of these NGOs, these non-governmental organizations that are disguised as human rights initiatives. And ultimately, these organizations, their main purpose, it is to become centers of information of anti-government propaganda. And they use these alleged like humanitarian assistance that they give to some vulnerable communities as a way to pretend that is their main work. But in reality, when you dig into them, you realize that they are connected with right-wing groups, that they are pushing the same narrative that the US has about Venezuela. You realize that their main purpose is to create these reports that then mainstream media uses to perpetuate this idea that Venezuela is a place where human rights are constantly being violated, or a place where the economic crisis it is caused only because of failed socialist policies by the government, and they ignore the entire context of what is happening in Venezuela. For example, I don't know if you remember that we have like really violent street protests here in Venezuela in 2014 and 2017. And one of the NGOs that were operating here at the time, that are still operating in Venezuela at the time, such as Provea, which I think is one of the most recognizable ones, they were the ones who created like this record, like these reports about what was happening in the country during those violent protests. And they created this narrative that these protests were peaceful, that there was nothing wrong happening there, that everything that was wrong was the government being repressive or violently attacking the peaceful protesters and that sort of thing. And they were the ones who gave sort of like the documents, the proof that international media needed to tell the world that, oh, this is happening in Venezuela. There's a dictatorship, and NGOs are telling that the government is repressing peaceful protesters, ignoring completely exactly what was happening at the time. And these reports, this narrative that these NGOs created during this difficult time, during this violent protest, later became the ground for a demand that Venezuela has in the International Court of Justice, a demand that was brought up by the opposition groups here in Venezuela. So they're not innocent. The work they do, the reports that they create, the things that they say to international media, it is used to fit this narrative that Venezuela is a dictatorship, to fit the narrative that Venezuela needs foreign intervention, to fit the narrative that the US government or that Washington, whoever is the president, is trying to bring a democratic transition to Venezuela. So they're not innocent in any way, shape, or form. That's why I think that what the Venezuelan National Assembly is doing right now, which is discussing a law to try to prevent that these NGOs continue flourishing with resources that are coming from the US State Department, because that is something that we have to discuss as well. NGOs are funded by US agencies, such as USAID, such as NET, so many other agencies in the US that give money to these NGOs so they can, and they do it under the disguise that they are trying to help the protection of human rights in Venezuela, that are trying to help to create a democratic transition in Venezuela. And so, yeah, the government right now, the Venezuelan National Assembly right now is discussing this law to be able to make sure that NGOs don't get to receive money from foreign governments to push the agenda of those foreign governments in our country. And I think that's actually that every single country in Latin America should do, because NGOs in Latin America are absolutely devastating when it comes to left governments trying to build a project that goes against the interests of US imperialism.
Oh, it's absolutely an extension of US imperialist power in the region. And I think that point can't be made strong enough. And the other day I was talking with some colleagues who are, going to accompany the Venezuelan election, and they were talking about how it's very difficult to push back against that narrative. It's overwhelming. The story of Venezuela and the Bolivarian Revolution and the Maduro government has been very firmly set in the mindset, I think, of your average North American, consumer of news, right? It's not really something that for people who only inform themselves with these, US State Department stenographers masquerading as journalists are firmly convinced, right, that it's a dictatorship, it's violence, there are human rights abuses, et cetera, et cetera. It's very difficult to push back against that narrative, and frankly, to kind of revert it would be even a harder challenge. And that role of these NGOs, I think, is very well understood by our class enemies, and that's why they put so much emphasis on it, put so much money behind it. And for example, the case of these human rights organizations, that's something that I'm particularly personally very passionate about. It's actually the reason I decided to do further higher studies in human rights, was because I was frustrated at how much this issue, human rights, which actually belongs to us, it belongs to the left, it belongs to people who want to see a better world, has been weaponized, instrumentalized against processes of transformation. And it's incredibly frustrating. And it really kind of makes it difficult for us to be able to do our work, to actually tell a more accurate narrative and on the ground perspective of different social actors who aren't being paid these fat salaries. I wanted to mention something that you wrote here in the column, which you say, only this year, the U.S. foreign assistance to Latin America and the Caribbean approved $54 million to, quote, support democratic actors, human rights advocates, and other civil society organizations, end quotes. Now, $54 million isn't a lot of money in the grand scheme of things, but when you're talking about funding these organizations that are going to be parroting the State Department narrative, that are going to be putting out this information about alleged human rights abuses, it's an extraordinary amount of money, right? Like, Venezuelanalysis is a small team, and we operate, I'm not going to say exactly how much, but it's a fraction of that on a yearly basis, right? A very small fraction of that. So imagine how much you can actually promote with that kind of money. I was preparing a budget for a different organization, right? And I'm like, trimming here and there to make it work and all this kind of stuff. It'd be extraordinary if you could get this kind of money. And that's why they're able to get so effective. And they really put themselves front and center in terms of the narrative around Venezuela. Just the other day, there was a piece, I think it was in the New York Times, about how Maduro can steal the election. And who was quoted? Provea. Of course they were, right? They're the ones who have occupied that space. And it's been interesting. I know it's a different context and a different region, and I don't pretend to be an expert on it, but the reaction of the Washington Beltway to the bill in the country of Georgia, which similarly was basically looking to set up accountability mechanisms around foreign funding, just like, oh no, this is a threat to democratic aspirations. I'll end with this thing. Yesterday I was writing the brief for the website, and we hadn't had a comment yet about talks renewing between Venezuela and the United States. The State Department hadn't said anything. AP even reached out and they said that they didn't have a comment yet. So I was like, well, probably going to come up in the State Department briefing. So I subjected myself to it, which is really frustrating because we've seen, especially around this issue with Palestine, just how craven they are, how nasty these spokespeople are, how they go out of their way to manipulate the reality and promote their narrative. But anyway, the deputy spokesperson for the State Department was answering questions like that, and they asked about Venezuela, about it, and the way even though he answered it was just kind of like, well, as you know, we support the democratic aspirations of the Venezuelan people, and they should go forward with the Barbados Accords, that kind of thing, right? And that's the thing that I found so disconcerting, is that they don't even try to convince you anymore. They know how firmly established that narrative is. But anyway, and so I think that's the point. That's why we should be paying attention to these organizations. And I think it's absolutely fair to ask, where did this money come from? What are they actually doing with this money? Who are these actors? And, just because they call themselves human rights defenders, are they actually advocating those interests? I would argue no.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct about that. And I just wanted to add one thing, because you mentioned about Venezuelanalysis. And of course, we are a reader-funded media, and we operate on a really humble budget, to say in some way. And it is amazing because we have in Venezuela a bunch of media outlets that are also, they also receive funds from US agencies under the same democratic promotion program that they invent themselves. And not only from the United States, but also from the UK government and many, many institutions, Western institutions that like to fund media outlets in Venezuela so they can promote this democratic transition narrative. So we have a bunch of outlets here that, they have become like spoke people for the narrative of Western governments. And it is funny because I don't know if you remember this, but not so long ago, one of these outlets actually wrote an article about Venezuelanalysis, and they wrote about us, about every single one of us, saying how we are like sort of like doubting where do we come from, because some of us work in Telesur, others work for this Russian outlet. Like I don't even remember exactly what, but it was like simply stating our curriculum, like where did we work before, and it's all like media outlets and that sort of thing. And this is one of those outlets that is funded by the UK government, by this democracy promotion program that the UK government has been provided for media outlets since 2021, or even before, since 2021. I think it was in 2021 when we found out about this fund being given to media outlets in Venezuela, but it's probably since way before that. So yeah, it is funny that these media outlets, they present themselves as these lights of democracy, like that they are telling the truth about Venezuela, and in reality, they operate under the budget of a Western foreign government. So yeah, so that's another tactic that they use for soft power. They use media outlets to create a narrative that they want about Venezuela. There's another strategy about soft power that I think you heard about also. That it's sort of it was something. It was a news that many people didn't pay attention to because it seems so, I don't know, it seems so fake, but it's actually quite real. There is this agency that is called Venezuela Affairs Unit. It is sort of like, it works closely with the US State Department, and their main purpose, and this is something that says in their website, that this Venezuela Affairs Unit has as a top priority to restore democracy in Venezuela. So there is an office in the US State Department created exclusively to restore democracy in Venezuela. And one of the things they do to restore democracy in Venezuela is that they create this sort of like a scholarship program. Like they give money to Venezuelan researchers, Venezuelan academics, Venezuelan students, so they can create these projects, these academic projects. And the thing about these academic projects is that they have to be about Venezuela and the United States having shared values. Like they have to find the connection between U.S. culture and Venezuelan culture, U.S. Political agenda and Venezuelan politics. So they have to propose something in the academic field that presents the idea that Venezuela and the U.S. are very similar and they should stay together. And also, these academic students, this is something that I was I was laughing about it, but at the same time, it's so incredibly insulting because these people who receive this money from the Venezuela First Unit, they also have to stay in contact with a U.S. expert, a U.S. institution to make their project. Like they have to be like tutored by someone in the U.S. in order to create this proposal, to present this project that they're going to receive money for. And the idea is that this U.S. expert, this U.S. academic, or these U.S. institutions is going to teach these Venezuelan researchers about why Washington policy about Venezuela is so good. They're going to teach them the U.S. perspective about why they are doing this to promote democracy in Venezuela. So it is like a brainwashing operation that they are seeking victims in Venezuela. Like, we're going to give you some amount of money, so will you make a project about how we are the good guys and how we want democracy in Venezuela. So at the end of the day, this might seem like harmless, like it's not really a big deal. But if you think about it, if you do this, if you continue to create these programs and create sort of like brainwash so many people in the country in order to make them believe that they have to adopt U.S. cultural, political, and economic values, you are creating the conditions for Venezuela to have more political destabilization, for Venezuela to have more conditions for any kind of coup or political operation against the government to be successful. Thankfully, this hasn't happened because one of the good things about Venezuela, the Venezuelan government, is that they always seem to have they're always hyper vigilant about these things. So they always catch these things before anyone else does. So immediately, the Venezuelan government has denounced this attempt to pay Venezuelan students to create proposals, and they have counteracted about it, saying that we have academic programs that people here can use, and they can receive all the support and the economic support that they need in order to create the project that they want without any conditions about what they have to write about, what they have to investigate about. So yeah, that's another one. That's another soft power strategy that I think is very useful to know.
I'm really glad you mentioned that Efecto Cocuyo piece. I actually had forgotten about it until I read about it in your column. There's this saying in English, right? Every accusation is actually a projection. And they think that we're all the same, right? Like, just because they're aligned with political actors and with a regime change strategy, they think that, Venezuelanalysis, which does honest, on-the-ground reporting, must clearly have some kind of secret link to the government. And yeah, it was really wild accusations just because one of our columnists happened to have been formerly, for example, Reinaldo Iturriza used to be Minister of Communes, right? He's obviously no longer in the government. People are allowed to move on with their lives. And these are probably the same people who wouldn't say anything about the fact that Jen Psaki, who used to be the spokesperson for the White House, now has her little show on MSNBC, right? And I think when they try to accuse us of that, it just reveals how hollow their morals are, right? They think that we're like them. We're not like them. We do this because we believe in a different kind of journalism, an anti-imperialist journalism, one that's connected to movements and things like that. But I also wanted to pick up on what you said about cultural imperialism, because I think that's really important as well. We've seen examples of this. We talked a little bit about it on the website a number of years ago, but I remember that awful show, Jack Ryan, where it was clearly about Venezuelan, about I think what was the plot line? Something about ties to terrorists and a dirty bomb. It's just like ridiculous stuff, right? But we have to remember the audience that's consuming this believes it. They think that these aren't narrative fiction stories, right? These are, it must be based on true events and this kind of thing. There was that video game, same thing. where it was about invading Venezuela. And then we saw it happen, actually, like you mentioned, with this whole, Operation Gideon, where we actually saw. Now, the U.S. will say, well, we knew nothing about it, but, evidence has since come to light that they were very well aware of it, right? And, obviously they didn't give a heads up to the government because they were happy to see it succeed. Obviously, it was a huge failure, and we know how the CIA operates. They wash their hands in case, they deny having any knowledge of that. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the ways that I think to return to beginning around hard power. And I think some of the lessons that maybe we can draw out of the experience that we saw in Bolivia very recently. Now, I do want to say that there is some dispute within elements of MAS. There's a long-running dispute between different groups inside of Bolivia, those that are aligned with Evo and those that are aligned with Arce. And it looks like the people who are aligned with Evo Morales have cast some doubt in terms of the authenticity of this coup attempt. But nonetheless, what we saw on the streets, whether it was preordained and designed previously as some kind of strategy or not, what we saw was tanks on the street and an attempt to change constitutional law using military force. And I think, as someone who works a lot on Mexico as well, it's really frustrating, the discussion that happens around that, because, oftentimes people who present themselves as progressives or leftists will say that, oh, López Obrador is committing a huge mistake by militarizing society. I've talked about this on the other podcast that I do about, I think they're not specific enough when they talk about militarization, but even if we take them at their word, right? This increasing role of the armed forces in civil society, right? In fact, one of the places I always point to is Venezuela. And in Venezuela, it has a name, La Unión Cívico-Militar. And there's a reason behind it, right? Like Chavez, having come from the armed forces, come from the experience and knowing very well what the military doctrine was at the time about the use of hard power, of the promotion of coups, understood that there had to be a closer connection between the population, the civilian population, and the armed forces. And in fact, in many ways, neoliberalism hollowed out the state so thoroughly in Venezuela that the only state agency that was even capable of carrying out programs was the armed forces. And so, I think there's some ignorance in terms of, what does it actually mean to have that kind of close alignment between the civilian forces and the armed forces. But one of the points I wanted to make was that Venezuela experienced a coup in 2002. And that coup was reverted because of that civil-military union, of understanding that this is a latent threat. This can always happen. And so what we saw in Bolivia, like I said, despite the fact that there's some dispute about whether or not it was authentically a coup or not, it still represents that threat. The armed forces, if they want to break with constitutional order, they have the ability to do so. They can rally up enough troops. They can take over the main public square in the capital of the country. They can break down the door of the government building and start demanding things that they have no right to be demanding. So I was wondering if I could hear your thoughts on this, about the fact that we shouldn't forget that hard power, the threats of coups, military invasions is still something that is something worth paying attention to and being prepared to have to confront if it should come to pass. And I think that applies to any transformation process happening in Latin America.
Yeah, so I think when the coup was happening in Bolivia, there were a couple of things that I immediately thought about when it was happening. The first was that how incredible fragile our democracies still are, in the sense that we still have that persistent threat, that we have these right-wing groups supported by the United States, supported by European countries, that are always going to find a moment in time where they can try to overthrow a government and to install basically a dictatorship, because that's what happened in Bolivia previously when the coup against Evo Morales. A dictatorship was the thing that followed. And not only that, but there were like massacres, like people were murdered because they were against the cutthroats, they were against the dictator. So that's the first thing that I thought, like, wow, many times when President Maduro talks about the constant coup attempts that are happening in Venezuela, many times we don't even find out about them until he says that this was happening and we stopped it, and nothing happened, but it was there. It was being planned. Many times people say, even people from our side are constantly saying like, yeah, this is an exaggeration. Like, who is stopping coups like right and left all the time? Like, this is too much. And in truth, it may sound a little bit, I don't know, ridiculous sometimes that there is always some sort of plot happening against the government, against our institutions. But truth be told, I think it is completely real that these things are happening. Maybe they are not all big coup plans that are happening. Maybe sometimes it is just small things, a small thing to try to stabilize the government. But it is true that these things are happening all the time. I mean, if we look now at what just happened in Bolivia, we come to realize that, yeah, we cannot let our guards down. We cannot be all confident thinking that, no, these people, they're not planning anything, nothing is happening. We can just let things be and not be vigilant about it. And that's not true. We need to protect our democracies. We need to protect our countries from these fascistas that are always in the dark, lurking, trying to take power again. So that's the first thing that popped to my mind. The second one was I was really impressed by the response of the Bolivian people. How they immediately went to the streets, how they immediately, I mean, I think it was amazing. It was like fearless. Like you can tell that they were not going to let what happened in 2019 happen again this year. They were absolutely against the idea that they were going to be subject again to an unelected government, that their rights were going to be forgotten. So it was an amazing response, and I think the Bolivian people deserve a lot of recognition for basically stopping the coup themselves, because I think that's what did it. The response of the people was what stopped the coup itself. I think finally, like you said, the last thing that I actually also thought about was how important it is that here in Venezuela we have this civic military union still going on. It remains strong. I think Chavez, as a military leader himself, I think he knew he was so right about this, that he needed to make the military part of the revolutionary process. He needed to make the military, he needed to install values of sovereignty, of self-determination, of independence in the military. He knew that was a key component in order for the revolution to continue, in order for the revolution to survive, even if he wasn't present. And he said that many times. He said the civic military union didn't depend on him being present, on him being alive or being still the president of Venezuela. He mentioned many times that the idea was that the military became an organization that was created for defending the country's sovereignty, defending the country's democracy against any kind of foreign intervention, against any kind of inside coup. And I think he did an amazing job in installing these values in our military, because even today, after so many years without Chavez, this military civic union is still very strong. And that is something that has, I believe, saved us from having another coup in Venezuela. Of course, it's not without his, I don't know, bad actors who say one way. We still have some military that, of course, can be bribed, or they can become part of these coups that the right is always planning. We saw it in 2019 when Guaido tried to make Juan Guaido the fake president that we have for a few years. He tried to make a coup d'etat, and he used some people from the military. But of course, these are like sort of like isolated cases. And in reality, the civic military union in Venezuela is still going on very strong. And yeah, so the coup in Bolivia made me realize that Chavez definitely did the right thing there.
And I like what you mentioned about where there's so many coup attempts and assassination attempts that it almost sounds like they're exaggerating, but then the proof is there. In fact, sometimes the proof is in front of everybody's eyes to see. And even then, to kind of go back to our first conversation around soft power, these media outlets will continue to try to cast doubt on it. Like, don't believe your lying eyes. Where I remember very distinctly the assassination attempt with the drones. And I remember watching it happening live, and people were saying, oh no, we've had reports from firefighters who say it was a gas cylinder explosion. And then there was clearly video of the drones exploding in front of everybody's eyes. And even now, if you look up articles, they say Maduro claims was an assassination attempt. Well, what the hell was it otherwise? I mean, if it wasn't an assassination attempt, what was it? I mean, we all saw it. There's video of it. It's just, and then they still insist on trying to convince you otherwise, right? And then that's why they'll be like, oh, and Maduro once again claimed that they had to disrupt a coup attempt. Just a few days ago, they discovered that these wires for a bridge were intentionally cut. These are the kinds of sabotage that they engage in. And that kind of brings me to what I wanted to talk about here at the end, which is that we have the election coming up. July 28th is going to be a very important date on the calendar. And within our editorial chat, we were talking about this, and where I made the comment that no matter what, it's going to be a really long night. And I say that because of the following. If the opposition claims victory and the results don't reflect that, well, they're going to do what they did with Enrique Capriles. And so, it's either going to be that, or, if the results show that PSUV won, then they're going to be all of this kind of narrative in the media as well, saying that, oh, this had to be a fraudulent result because the polls had said 20 points ahead, right? And so, anyway, no matter what the circumstance, whatever the actual result is on the night of the election, it's going to be a very long night. And we're likely to walk into another scenario of months and months of destabilization, of this narrative that Venezuela is not a democracy. How is it possible that he won re-election? Or, obviously then the opposition must have won, all this kinds of stuff that we know is going to be put out there. And it's going to be another attempt to try to use all of these different instruments to maybe sow more discontent amongst the armed forces and maybe successfully pull off a coup this time. And so I wanted to close on that. What are your thoughts with the election? It's very hard to say where things are at. I mean, I think the opposition's made a lot of really critical mistakes. Like a lot of people, you showed a video to me just yesterday where they're like, who are you going to vote for? And everybody says Maria Corina Machado when she's not on the ballot. She's not a candidate. They're going to go into the ballot box and she's not going to be there. They're not going to know who to vote for. I also think that they're playing a very dangerous game. Maria Corina Machado goes out there and starts talking about when I'm president, like, you're not running, and you can't actually pretend that somebody else is going to run in your place and you're going to be the real power. That's not constitutional. It's an affront to the voters. It's not democratic. You can't do that. And I think that's actually sufficient grounds from my point of view. I'm not an expert, but I've observed a lot of elections. I know a lot about electoral processes. That's grounds to nullify the result. I mean, arguably, they could say, well, you didn't really run a candidate. You ran a guy who pretended to run because you actually were going to put somebody else in power. And therefore, the population doesn't actually get represented in the executive, even if they do win a majority of votes with their standing candidate. So it's a very complicated, difficult to predict. Clodovaldo has a really good column as well. He talks about the unknowns, but I wanted to hear your thoughts. How do you feel about the election going forward? And what, more importantly, should international observers, listeners of the podcast, readers of the website, what should they be paying attention to with this election on July 28th?
So first I want to add a little more about what you said about this trick that mainstream media uses about Maduro claims, which is also happened with U.S. sanctions. Like every news article that you read about Venezuela's economy, it is Maduro claims that U.S. sanctions are responsible for the country's economic crisis and blah, 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 blah. There's always this Maduro claim trick, right? And even though we have like studies, like we have experts from all over the world, we have people from even inside the U.S. government admitting that U.S. sanctions are responsible for the crisis in Venezuela. But this trick continues to be used. And I think that is exactly what they do with elections. I'm sorry, that is my cat. I know you can hear my one of my cats. And so, yeah, I think that is exactly what they're going to use when it comes to elections. They are going to say, well, Maduro claims that he won the election in the scenario that, of course, he wins the elections. And if that happens, if we have the scenario of Maduro winning, which is something that, in my perspective, it is very likely, not just because I believe that he has the most popularity among the candidates, but because they have the advantage of this really incredible organization to make sure that all of their supporters go out and vote, which is something that other countries do not have. So I think in this scenario where Maduro wins, that is going to be the headline. Maduro claims that he won. The opposition says that it is a fraudulent election. This is why they didn't sign the agreement that recently the Venezuela's electoral authorities, they created this document for all 10 candidates to sign, saying that they're going to respect the electoral results, that they're going to make sure that whatever transition that happens, whoever is elected, that what comes after, it is a peaceful process, that there aren't going to be any strict violent protests or whatever. And of course, the right-wing candidate Edmundo González, who is, like you said, basically the candidate of María Corina Machado, he didn't sign the agreement. Why? Because of course they're going to claim that it was a fraud election in case they don't win. So they cannot sign any agreement that contradicts that narrative that they always have and that they're going to use time and time again, even when they never have any kind of proof of fraud in the elections. So I think we're going to see a scenario where they claim that the election is fraudulent and where they're going to probably call for some sort of violence in the country. I don't think they're going to succeed because I think that the government, the military, I think they are prepared for a scenario like that and they're prepared to contain any kind of violence. But I also think that was something that the opposition will do in the case of Maduro winning is that they're going to make sure that the U.S. reaction to it is going to be very strong. I think they're going to try to make sure that the U.S. either imposes more sanctions. I don't know how they will do that, but or maybe enforce the sanctions that are already in place. I think they're going to make sure that they're going to advocate for the United States to punish Venezuela even more than they have already done it. I think in the very unlikely scenario that Edmundo wins, because as you said, the opposition has made such a horrible campaign strategy in which they have promoted, Maria Corina herself has promoted herself as the candidate of the opposition, when in reality she isn't going to be in the ballot. So many people, when you go out to the street and you ask people who are you voting for, many people say Maria Corina Machado. And I know this personally because even people who I know closely, like family members, have told me, yeah, I'm going to vote for Maria Corina Machado. And I'm like, yeah, she's not on the ballot. You're not going to find her there. So that is a reality. They have made such a horrible strategy promoting Edmundo González because people don't know him. People still think that Maria Corina is the candidate, but whatever. Let's say that there is a scenario where Edmundo wins. I think one of the first things we're going to realize the second he wins is that he is not the president. He's not really the president of Venezuela. That he was just, like you said, a face, someone used to make sure that Maria Corina could participate in the elections in any whatever way. And I think we're quickly going to find out that he's going to become, well, basically, I would call her a dictator because since you're not elected and you're running the country, you're acting like a dictator. And I think that's the position that she's going to assume. I can imagine that he will name her vice president and that will make her sort of like, he will give her some sort of legality in order to act like president or something like that. But ultimately, it is an absolute deceit because you cannot tell people that this man is the one running for president when he doesn't have any kind of political or economic project. He's running on behalf of Maria Corina. Everyone can tell that she's the one pulling the strings behind in the whole show. So I think, like you said, this is grounds for not only nullifying the results in case he wins and then we find out that she's the one that is going to actually run the government, but I actually believe that this is grounds for disqualifying his candidacy altogether because they are selling a candidacy that is not true. He's selling himself as a candidate and everybody and this is something that we're not making up, because Maria Corina herself, every time she goes to a rally, every time she goes to talk to the public, she says, when I'm president of Venezuela. So she doesn't hide the fact that she is thinking that if Edmundo is elected, the one who becomes president is me. And she's saying this out loud to people all over the country. So I think there's actually grounds to nullify this candidacy, because it is completely fake. In any case, I don't think that is going to happen. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen, but I think what most people need to prepare for in these elections is the opposition, as always, playing the card of the victim, as always, trying to make sure that the Venezuela's electoral system to cast some shade on the electoral system, to say that it is not reliable, even when we have like the Venezuelan people who are the ones who are guarding the system, the ones who are making sure that the whole voting process, it is done well and nothing tampers with the voting process. Even when it is their war against the entire Venezuelan people, being able to testify that the voting process is safe, is secure, it is secret, I think they're going to still claim that the Venezuelan electoral system somehow was manipulated. Of course, that's going to be the narrative that they're going to use for mainstream media to support the fact that Maduro again re-elected himself or something like that. Because that is what they have been saying since 2018, that he re-elected himself in the position. When it comes to electoral observers, international electoral observers, I honestly think that many of these organizations come here with good intentions. You know, we have the African Union, we have CARICOM, the Caribbean organization, and I think many of them come here with really good intentions. Are going to give really good feedback about how to improve the process. I think they are going to truly do the role that they are meant to do, which is simply observe the election and testify that everything is being done correctly. But I think there's going to be, as always, some international actors that are going to come here and are going to use this opportunity to try to criticize an electoral system without any grounds, without any real proof, and just repeat the same that is being said about Venezuela's elections since years ago. And I think we have to be prepared for that. Not everyone here is going to come with good intentions. Some things are going to be distorted.
Yeah, and I think that kind of ties it all together with this discussion that we had around soft power, hard power, about U.S. intervention. I mean, to talk about Bolivia again, we saw what the OAS's election observation mission, what role they played in driving the coup narrative. I don't think the coup would have been able to be carried out the way that it was had it not been for the OAS's report and alleging things that didn't correspond to the reality on the ground, saying that there was all kinds of electronic interference and a third server and all this kinds of BS, frankly, which shows just how far what these actors who are not there on a good faith basis are actually capable of doing. So I'm glad that the OAS is not going to be in Venezuela. I'm glad the European Union is not going to be in Venezuela. I don't trust them. I was disappointed when I found out that they had sent an observation mission here in Mexico. We don't need them, right? Like, as if we need the blessings of the U.S. Ministry of Colonies to have free and fair elections. And obviously, I mean, we could even have a long discussion about how unfair elections are in the United States. But anyway, that's not the topic of today's conversation. I really appreciate you spending this time with us and exploring this different format, having a conversation, going back and forth, talking at length about these kinds of things. I think hopefully our listeners and our readers appreciate it because, like I said, we're a humble team, we're a small crew, but we're really deeply engaged. As you can hear, Andreína knows a lot about the situation on the ground, has done some excellent research on it. And I encourage everybody to check out the column in our continuing coverage. And in fact, on the issue of how the voting system is, we have an infographic coming out that's going to explain just how Venezuela's voting system works and why it has all kinds of checks and balances. just to kind of counter some of that narrative. I saw that story in the New York Times that was talking about how the maker of the voting machines in one of the elections said, oh, it was manipulated, which was, again, a comment that was made that obeys to a broader strategy about regime change and actually isn't true once you dig a little bit deeper. But that's the narrative. And be sure to check out Venezuelanalysis.com for news and analysis on all things Venezuela, in particular in this election time. And I also want to remind our readers and listeners that we're in the middle of a fundraising campaign. And Andreína and I are both big Star Wars nerds. So we were both really happy to choose the theme this time around, which we strike back against the empire, and thinking about that, right? It's always interesting. We talked a little bit about Hollywood and cultural imperialism, but the way I'm just going to finish with this little anecdote. I was really lucky, and I got to go to the Star Wars land, Galaxy's Edge, when I was on a speaking tour in Los Angeles. So I convinced my partner to accept and to go check this out because I'm such a big Star Wars nerd. And this was right around the time where the Palestinian resistance was engaging in its struggle against, it was only a few days removed from October 7th, where they had struck back against the Zionist entity. And it was just mind-blowing to me that we were in this ride in Disneyland that it quite literally has you walking through tunnels, underground secret tunnels where weapons are stored, where the resistance is striking back against the empire. And so many of the people there just didn't make that connection, because at the same time, Hamas and the other Palestinian resistance factions are very much engaged in the same exact thing. This is what they're doing. Oh, but when it's a theme park ride, then it's all fun and games. When it's actually happening in the real world, then they're condemned. It's just extraordinary to me how powerful that narrative is. And so that's why it's so important to have an alternative, to have people like Venezuelanalysis on the ground reporting. And of course, the Venezuelanalysis team is going to be on the clock, round the clock, reporting on the presidential elections. Obviously, we've already been reporting the lead up. The campaign officially begins this Thursday. And so that means, there's going to be an increase of activities. And of course, on election day and the days following, because we know there's probably going to be destabilization attempts covering everything that's happening. So be sure to tune into Venezuelanalysis.com. And also, those of you who are available, please consider donating and supporting our work on the ground. We are reader funded. Efecto Cucuyo wants to say that we're tied to the Venezuelan government. We are not. We don't receive money from them. That's not what we're about. In fact, we really value our independence, and I think that's really important. That's made possible by the support of our viewers, our listeners, our readers. So please consider supporting us. It's Venezuela.com/donate. Andreína, again, thanks so much for sharing all of your